Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to RoundTable Talk, where I dissect, analyse and review the latest releases as well as some old classics. You're joining me here as we continue our Drake season as we revisit his entire discography from the very beginning. We've made it all the way to Views, so yeah, let's get into it. Before I give a little bit of context to this album, released in 2016, please do remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and if you're a big Drake fan, make sure to check out the rest of the videos going all the way back to Room for Improvement. So, following you, if you're reading this, it's too late. It didn't take long for Drake to become embroiled in the now famous beef and feud with his former friend, Meek Mill. Meek Mill, of course, outed Drake as using a ghostwriter on this mixtape. And as I said on my last revisit, Drake had been preparing for this kind of war all through the last, couple of years. And during this beef, the tension that had built up between Drake, The Weeknd, Kendrick, Diddy, Jay, Kanye, all was unleashed on Meek Mill with the full force and the full quality of Drake's pen. Drake had shown in previous years that conflict and beef had lent him a fair level of inspiration and especially added a sharpness to his pen and to writing bars, as you can see, in his disses towards Common, his disses towards the Throne, as well as even the bonus track on If You're Reading This, called 6 PM in New York, where Drake says the iconic line aimed at Tiger, which is, "You need to act your age and not your girl's age," and that kind of wit is what allows Drake to win this beef with Meek, and also a social media savviness as well that Drake has shown and his team have shown throughout his career. If You're Reading This and Nothing Was the Same showed a lot of Drake's desperation to be cemented as the #1 rapper in the game, and the Meek beef gave him the opportunity to have a very clear win within hip-hop, which is something that he'd struggled with, being the versatile artist that he is, to get that sort of hip-hop respect. And winning a beef probably is the most respected Drake has ever been in hip-hop. It's well documented, but Drake outsmarted Meek, used social media against him, used memes, and as I said, used really witty songwriting. Also made his diss record a hit, which obviously would really hurt Meek as well. Continued to be respectful of Nicki Minaj in the beef as well, which I think again won him lots of plaudits. While back-to-back effectively ended Meek's career at that time, it gave rise in Drake definitely a level of arrogance and a level of confidence he hadn't really shown previously. And that saw the rest of 2015, and as well as almost half of 2016, Drake on what you'd call almost a victory lap. He worked on a full collaborative mixtape with Future, again, building up his street cred amongst the burgeoning trap sound that was coming out of Atlanta at the time. And with that mixtape continues what he started on If You're Reading This, where he surrounded himself with people with much more street credibility than his own. His bars are full of anger and aggression, and he continued to fire shots at Meek even though he'd won on tracks like I'm the Plug, on What a Time to Be Alive, on Digital Dash, as well as Summer 16 as well, a track we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on. I chose not to fully revisit What a Time to Be Alive because it is pretty much an extension of the beef, and If You're Reading This, It's too late, and much of the same themes are kind of addressed, as well as Drake's newfound level of confidence. But the last track, 30 for 30, does show a little bit of insight into the beef itself and how Drake felt that the entire industry was against him in this beef and was actually on Meek's side, and that Drake was the underdog and against all odds managed to defeat them. There's a reference to higher ups in the music industry, which could refer to Diddy, Jay, anybody who's been a veteran in the game. And it's a paranoia that I said before, is explored on If You're Reading This, but you can see on the more introspective 30 for 30 that it is still affecting Drake despite this more triumphant feel, and potentially the paranoia is affecting him even more so at this point, and leading him to a level of complete mistrust of everybody, seeing that he was literally betrayed by his friend Meek. The Kendrick beef seems to have simmered down during this time period. It does seem as though Kendrick did bait Drake a little bit on Untitled Unmastered, but it's clear also that I think Drake decided not to continue with that kind of beef, especially after the Meek situation sort of boiling up at the same time. And then in the lead up to this, Drake appeared on a DJ Khaled track called For Free, where he shouts out Kendrick, which feels a little bit like a peace offering. And it's been quiet between the two pretty much ever since then. Despite all this, and despite the confidence that Drake clearly gained from getting this clear win, when it came to writing his Views, the album that he'd been building up since 2014 as his next studio album, he was clearly in an entirely different headspace to that when he announced it. And while Views is still rooted in the city in the same way, obviously the From the Six section of the title was removed, and it feels that Drake is struggling throughout this album at a very important juncture in his career, as the album when he's clearly at his peak, at the top and at his most popular. Drake is struggling to write raps that aren't angry or aren't paranoid. And you really can hear it on Views that there is a massive amount of writer's block on this album. Something that, you know, Joe Budden called lack of inspiration. In my opinion, that's not really what it is. It definitely feels as though Drake suffered a lot from writer's block and struggled to tap into the usual depth of emotions that he's had on previous albums, purely because he's so preoccupied with his paranoia and the hurt from the betrayal that he suffered. It's clear in 2016 that Drake was really only finding joy in dancehall music, in the music influenced by the Caribbean. And despite that being where his heart clearly lies around this time period, Drake feels the pressure of this album. And I would say that Views definitely did turn Drake into an icon within music. It's still an album that clearly shows he's really unsure of his direction and tries to do everything at once. Obviously the love for dancehall was kind of revealed on the track Work, and I think Drake saw a lane there for, you know, to allow him to continue his pop aspirations but not go pure R&B. But because it tries to do everything at once, Views is overlong and even attempts this really arbitrary seasons concept as though, you know, listening to the album is you moving through the seasons of Toronto. In my opinion, that kind of conceit, that kind of concept pretty much sounds like an excuse for a lack of cohesion in the album. But as I said, there really is an emptiness to his actual rapping on this mixtape. That's not to say there's not enjoyable tracks and that it's not an enjoyable album. It's just much more at arm's length, in my opinion, with the exception of a few tracks. It definitely feels like, as a listener, you're at arm's length from Drake's life. Whereas on previous projects, you really feel like you're inside his mind. And so while Drake won the battle with Meek, in terms of the war, I do still feel that Meek has forever tainted Drake's legacy in terms of ghostwriters, but it also really threw him off his game at a time where Drake really was sort of built up to drop his classic record. Drake has hinted in the past that, you know, this was initially going to be a complete dancehall album. I would have much preferred that, in that I feel like that the lack of cohesion really hurts Views, and if he'd committed to one idea, I feel like he could have done it very well, and if that was dancehall and that's what his heart was in, but I'd much prefer that. But it's clear from this album, and, you know, kind of from this point onwards in Drake's career, that he is fairly afraid to alienate any portion of his fan base, which, as I've said before, his versatility is obviously his greatest strength, but it's also a weakness too. As a side note, I guess, the beef with Meek had also seen him get a lot closer with Kanye West, who, as we'll go on to see in later years, was kind of using Drake to try and push and improve the life of Pablo when Kanye West himself was experiencing a writer's block. The pair were neighbours in Calabasas during this time, and of course rumoured to be working on a joint album. And then on Summer 16, Drake made a playful reference to having a bigger pool than Kanye, and it might sound like a really inane thing, but with the resentment that Kanye harbours towards Drake, these sorts of lines show that, you know, the pride in Drake. He underestimated the resentment that Kanye really has for him, as, in my opinion, Drake came into the game during the period that, you know, Kanye disappeared following the Taylor Swift incident, and kind of took over the mainstream and took over the spot from any kind of male rapper, something that I think Kanye has never really got over. And while Drake has always seen those kind of like playful jabs at Kanye as sport, it seems as though Kanye takes them very personally, as, you know, Drake has taken things very personally in the past as well. But yeah, Drake's reverence for Kanye, I think maybe clouded his judgment on those kind of jabs. He didn't really, and maybe still doesn't understand, the difficulty that Kanye has had in transitioning out of the young man's part of rap into the more, you know, experimental later part of his career. Summer 16 is also a pivotal track in that there's a line that Drake says he used to want to be on Rockefeller and he turned into Jay, and that again is exemplary of Drake's prideful attitude at this point. Following the Meek beef, he was clearly, you know, feeling himself, and that pride, I personally feel, is what leads him to the Pusha beef in 2018, which is something we'll talk about, of course, on the Scorpion revisit. But, you know, that line may have contributed to the fact that Jay didn't give him a verse for Pop Style. Obviously, I think what was actually going on during that time period were that Drake sort of signed up to work with Apple during their launch of Apple Music, while Jay was trying to build up Tidal. We'll never know whether Kanye, you know, caused this friction on purpose, As I said, you know, harboring that kind of resentment. Jay and Drake do trade bars back and forth a little bit in 2017, before then reconciling just before Scorpion. But yeah, Views, unlike If You're Reading This, which was deemed to be a mixtape, Views saw Drake return to a more standard rollout, appearing in interviews, releasing singles like One Dance and Pop Style, as well as riding high on the release of Hotline Bling, a track that had been released alongside back to back during the birth of OVO Sound Radio on Apple Music. And Hotline Bling saw Drake continue his sort of vocal experiments that he'd been doing over the past couple of years, but this time on a more tropical, more accessible beat. And it took time to catch on, but then again Drake showed his social media savviness, created the video, and the video just took it to another level. And I think it's that track that really gave Drake superstar status in the mainstream. It should have also been Drake's first #1 record, but was of course blocked by the comeback of Adele during that time. It's clear the success of Hotline Bling definitely spurred him on to make the music that made him happy, but to continue to lean into those pop aspirations, because that's where he's getting the most respect and the most obvious praise. And that led him to run the summer with One Dance. So yeah, while the dancehall elements of this album are definitely his strongest, there is a rushed element to a lot of this album, in my opinion. Not production side, but the writing itself. And you know, you never know whether the Apple deal changed the content or the direction that Views wanted to go in, and potentially, like Thank Me Later, tried to do everything at once because it was trying to appeal to the masses, because it was going to be an album that was, you know, launched alongside Apple Music and alongside OVO Sound Radio as Drake reached the most mainstream he's ever gotten. So from If You're Reading This to this album, Views really was built up to be, as every Drake album is now, to build up to be his classic. And in my opinion, it's clearly not a classic album, but it is better in retrospect. At the time, I think it was easy to feel let down by it, but there is also something for everyone on this album, depending on what type of Drake you enjoy. But yeah, all that context out of the way, let's dive into the album. First track, Keep the Family Close.
All of my let's just be friends, friends I don't have anymore. Like when Chrysler made that one car that looked just like the Bentley I. Even when it's business with you, it's personal again. You're so predictable, I hate people like you. I make all the players anthems for the real niggas. My luck is a short thing, cause I'm living right. I'm fooling and serving them all like I work for minimum wage. If I ever loved you, I'll always love you, that's how I was raised. All of my let's just be friends, friends I don't have anymore, much closer.
I think as soon as you hear Keep the Family Close, you know that this album isn't going to be in any way like What a Time to Be Alive, or If You're Reading This, It's Too Late. There's a real Bond theme vibe to this track, and it is really unlike anything Drake's ever done before. But again, it just feels as though Drake is trying to do everything at once, and you know, really shooting for that mainstream sound. The beat itself is pretty epic. It's from a producer called Manish, who Drake had never worked with before up until this album. But there are some great lines on it, like the line, if I ever loved you, I always love you, that's how I was raised. Really does seem to sum up Drake and his relationships with women. But then there's also the hint that he's talking about Nicki Minaj on this record, in talking about keeping the family close, talking about Young Money, Nicki Minaj. And it is interesting, you know, that we don't hear much about Young Money over this period of time, as again Drake seeks to position himself as this iconic rapper separate from Lil Wayne, Nicki Minaj and all. Keep the Family Close, I think is a good track, not a great one. And as I said, starts the theme of the seasons with the sort of transitions and the vocals and the snippets included in between tracks, to try and begin the album in a more wintry way. There's of course a sadness to it because of that sort of wintry vibe. But yeah, this isn't one of Drake's best ever songs, but it's also not one of his worst. It's just very middle of the road, and not in keeping, I think, with the tone-setting intros that Drake is usually capable of. But yeah, I don't mind Keep the Family Close, it's an alright song. But yeah, let's move on to the next track called 9.
Mama hit my phone and said rap's no good. You know 40 wants peace, but I'm down to cut ties for it. And I turn a 6 upside down, it's a 9 now. I made a decision last night that I would die for it. Keychain go jang-a-lang, MJ in every way, I just don't fade away.
9 shares a lot of the themes of If Reading This Is Too Late, people needing Drake when he's hot, beefing with people from the city, and the feeling that Drake can't have peace or even sleep due to the paranoia that's being created by his position at the top. It also continues the themes of and the preoccupation with death that ran through that entire mixtape. Actually samples a song called Dying by Mavado. He talks obviously about how Meek and others tried to end his career and, you know, kind of his life over the Quentin situation as well as the beef. And the outro sort of snippet at the end of like almost a recorded song of a song that didn't really make it vocalizes this as, you know, this album and the singles that preceded this album prove that despite the beef, Drake on a mainstream level at least is just as, if not more popular than ever. And despite the stain on his legacy about, you know, ghostwriting, he did gain a lot of respect for his handling of the beef, but also managed to maintain his domination in the mainstream too. But yeah, 9 is okay, a track again that was one of my least favourites when I first heard this album, but going back to it, again, not bad, very middle of the road, and I think that's one of the problems with Views, that a lot of the music is middle of the road, and with this track as well as the intro, both being middle of the road, it's not a very strong start to a body of work that's supposed to be quite conceptual and quite cohesive. But that does all change with the next track, You With Me.
On some DMX shit, I group DM my exes. We too deep in this thing, you'll never lose me. LOL, I'm glad you find this shit amusing. It's like a lot of games are being played, how's it going down? It's on till we gone and I got to know now. How much time you spend on them paragraphs so you getting me? All that gray in our conversation history, you slide on a late night, you'll send all you hit text without an invite. That's that shit that I don't like. We both made some mistakes, road. Yeah, how's that for real? 3 dots, you thinking of a reaction still. I made a career of reminiscing. And understand I got responsibilities, the people that I need, and on my way to make this dough. A lot of niggas cut the check so they could take this flow.
You With Me is easily in the top 2 tracks on Views for me personally. I think it's an example of peak Drake writing where he nails the little idiosyncrasies of this generation. Even just the talking about mechanics of texting is a really interesting aspect of writing that not many other rappers do. And it also sees him update a classic DMX song. Obviously it highlights Drake's possessive qualities that he's delved into a lot in the past, as well as his commitment issues as well. It's a good example of how he plays with flow on the beginning part of the song, as well as his transitions between singing and rapping, and this shouty flow that he engages upon right at the end, with that really cool P&D sort of sample / snippet in the middle of it. But there are some, you know, corny filler bars as well in there. The Happy Meal line is not one of Drake's finest moments, and again it's lines like these that show how difficult Drake has found it over this period of time to write introspective rap music, which, you know, he built his entire career on. And I think it's interesting that on this album, I think Drake, because of the ghostwriting rumours, the ghostwriting accusations, Drake went out of his way to not collaborate with people and to literally write every single line and come up with every single idea completely by himself, which I don't think he's ever done throughout his entire career. You know, previously working with The Weeknd, PARTYNEXTDOOR, Magic Jordan, all of these OVO artists, all collaborating really closely together on both their music, but also Drake's. And I feel like on Views, the sort of stale nature you get of it is that Drake doesn't have any sort of outside influences to help come up with new ideas, to push him in certain directions of sound. And the only sort of thing that does really change that on this album are the dancehall tracks. But still, I'm a huge fan of this song, especially the line I made a career off of reminiscing, a great line which again encapsulates a real huge element of Drake's career. And it's interesting as well that, you know, the last verse was actually leaked way back in 2014 with a little bit of changes, and was supposedly about Rihanna, when, as I said before on the previous album, the Views from the 6, the original scrapped album from 2014, 2015, was originally going to be the shouty R&B flow that Drake sort of adopted from and evolved from PARTYNEXTDOOR, and was influenced by his breakup relationship with Rihanna around that time period. And so this last verse could still be about her, despite the removal of the reference to the hotel they were known to have stayed at. But I think generally this track is more of a general comment on Drake's relationship with exes. But yeah, a fantastic song. and one that, as I said, stands as one of my favourites from this album. But yeah, next up, it's Feel No Ways.
I should be downtown whipping on the radio. Who is it that's got you all gassed up? Changing your opinion on me. I try with you. It's more to life than sleeping in and getting high with you. Now you're talking down on my name on purpose. Feel away, young nigga, feel away. I stop listening to things you say, cause you don't mean it anyway.
Feel No Ways is another standout from Views. It's one of those tracks that, for me, I feel like could have been way more, and it feels again that Drake is a little bit experimenting here with the P&D sort of vocal style, but combining that with the 80s sound that Magic Jordan provided as well. Obviously produced by Jordan Allman of Magic Jordan, and there are real 80s vibes to this track, and I've obviously in the past they've had success with Hold On We're Going Home, which is still Drake's best attempt at 80s. But Feel No Ways is one of those ones that, again, for me, while it is a great song, doesn't feel quite built out into what it could have been. And I reckon this could have been a massive hit had it been released at another time period when sort of dancehall wasn't dominating the charts. But it's interesting that it also continues the possessive theme that's addressed in You With Me, and was kind of, you know, brought to the fore towards the end of If You're Reading This It's Too Late. Then, you know, I guess delved into in the misogyny of What a Time to Be Alive. But here you see Drake again trying his best to delve deeper into his own feelings, but in my opinion kind of regressing in the way that he addresses topics. Again, addressing how, you know, a relationship he had in the past was unproductive, and that he left it to move on to accept his destiny as the #1 rapper in the game, and one of the biggest artists in the world. It does feel like this track has been done in more depth elsewhere in Drake's career, but that's not to say that I don't enjoy Feel No Ways. I think it is a fantastic one, and also a song that pretty much I don't think any other artist in rap could make. But yet again, it does show that I do wish that Drake had, you know, had some more sense of direction on this album, because again, a full album of this may have worked out some of the kinks of this sound and maybe narrowed his focus a little bit more. And you know, I wouldn't have been averse to a full album of this type of style. Feel No Ways definitely up there with some of the best of Views as well. Next up is Hype.
I pull up in Lexus like it's 07, I just hit a lick, I gotta hit the next one. Boss up, I'm the bigger homie, but I'm 1 year older than my little homie. That boy light is Michael Jackson, but I'm just done. I don't take this shit for granted, I do my own propaganda. A gram too poppin' the fuck of the chain, too heavy to tuck it, I'm serious. They gotta go, they gotta die out eventually. Me, I'm just done in the hype. Me, I'm just done.
Hype isn't one of my favourite Drake songs. It's pretty generic, it's pretty average, brag bars, just feels a little bit empty as well, production wise, but also in the writing, which is something that I mentioned before, and does feel as though Drake just made a rap track because there weren't enough rap tracks on the album. Although I do like one of the lines where he says, "My enemies want to be friends with my other enemies, so don't let it get to me." In that, you know, during these beefs, it's been shown over the years that Drake tries to, you know, fix a lot of his tensions when in beef with somebody else. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting line. Yeah, a lot of this track is kind of derivative of what was happening on What a Time to Be Alive. This track is nowhere near that level of passion and that sort of perfect storm moment that he and Future had at that time. Yeah, just a few subtle jabs at Meek, and despite him kind of like dismissing the beef, he's still talking about it on this track, which again I think is proof of how much of a writer's block that Drake still had, that the only thing he could write about at this time was about that circumstance and about his paranoia of being portrayed again. But yeah, Hype's not one of my favourite tracks. I'm not going to waste too much time chatting about it. But yeah, next track is Weston Road Flows.
Weston Road Flows, I did this shit for my nigga Rennie. He was wavy doing mixtapes out of your basement. I'm looking at they first week numbers like, what are those? I mean, you boys not even coming close. Look in the mirror, I'm closer than I really appear. Creeping like chili without the tender love and care. 40, the only one that know how I deal with the pressure. Tell me you love me, started seeing Monique. Last time I heard from Monique, T-Minus was making beats. The best ever, don't ever question, you know better. But shit ain't always how it seems when it's so together. been flowing stupid since Vince Carter was on some through the legs arm and a hoop shit. Drinking hypnotic with Glenn Lewis, I been through it. Y'all was so afraid to lay claim to it. Too busy face screwing on waist movements. I'm happiest when I can buy what I want, get high when I want. Yeah, that's right.
One of my favourites from Views, obviously a more reflective Drake. And again, talking about, you know, other rappers, other artists not measuring up, but also not being real in their interactions with Drake. There's more words for Meek about Lyric Galore, a woman who Meek and Drake had apparently both been dating during this time period. There's also a couple of lines for Tory Lanez as well, who is someone we've not mentioned yet. Around this time period, he'd sided with Meek in the Drake beef, having had his own tensions with Drake during this period of time, making up a lot of different things about Drake and using his, you know, newfound fame to kind of shoot down, you know, the biggest rapper to come out of Canada ever. And throughout Views and, you know, throughout, you know, the next 2 or 3 years of Drake's career, he would send various shots to Tory and his sort of new Toronto movement. He also mentions retiring as well on this track, retiring at the age of 35, which I think from 2020 is in maybe 1 or 2 years from now. So, you know, potentially could we see Drake retire at 35? I think it's pretty unlikely. And probably just something he said at the time because 35 felt so far away. And this track also sees Drake continue his sort of legend building that he did a lot on If You're Reading This, a little bit on Nothing Is the Same, to shine a light on the fact that Drake didn't grow up as sort of a rich kid, as some people assume because of his, you know, background as an actor. But yeah, it's a song that definitely stands up there as one of the best examples of Drake rapping on this album. If you put this track up against, you know, other tracks from other albums in terms of like pure rapping, it's probably on the lower end of that list. As I said, there's still a bit of the emptiness that, you know, sort of just hangs over this entire project, where Drake's heart just doesn't really feel in it as much as, you know, it usually would. You know, one of the main things you'd say about Drake's previous music is that it has so much heart. But yeah, production on this, really fantastic. The Mary J. Blige sample, again, shows how well Drake works with R&B samples and 90s R&B samples in particular. And the way Drake changes his flow in sync with the beat in the last, I think it's like maybe 16 bars of this record, really is something special. And definitely elevates this track to something more than just, you know, strict soulful beat, formulaic rapping, which sometimes Drake can fall into. But yeah, big fan of Weston Road Flows. Yeah, just a really cool example of Drake as a pure MC reminiscing on his life. Next up is Redemption.
Why would I say all these things to have you feeling away? I lost my way. I'm searching for these words. Redemption's on your mind when you think about run your mouth. I'd rather listen to someone else. That made me think of you so differently. I miss the feeling of you missing me. Say to you, and 80% of it wasn't true. You're over and done with me. Oh yeah. I tell them if they ain't with it, then let's just forget it. Guess I'm not in a position to deal with commitment. Erica sue me and open the business. Wonder when my shit drop, do they listen? Who's gonna save me when I need saving? Since Take Care, I've been caretaking.
Redemption's always felt like a bit of a companion piece to Marvin's Room, in my opinion. As well as You With Me, addresses a lot of the same kind of themes. It sees Drake pretty much at his most vulnerable, and I would say Redemption, despite it not being my favourite in terms of sort of delivery, production, just execution, I guess, it still is a good example of Drake still being able to tap into those emotions that I think he struggles with on this album on the whole, but on Redemption he does manage to do it. You know, it's a very heartfelt track that addresses his problems with commitment, which has been a constant theme throughout his discography, of how his dedication to taking his career to the biggest possible heights stops him from fully connecting and fully, you know, fully having a relationship with a woman. It's interesting, as I said as well, that he actually mentions the girl whose phone call is sampled on Marvin's Room, called Erica, who actually sued him for using her voice and used that money to start up her own business, which is something that Drake says almost with a level of pride, which again is an interesting element of his own personality. Yeah, it's a song, of course. The title Redemption sees Drake asking for forgiveness from his exes for how he talks about them in the music, but also how he treated them in the past. And again, it's a ridiculously vulnerable song that not many other rappers still, even to this day, with the more, you know, with emotion being more accepted in hip hop, no other rapper other than Drake would really talk about their emotions in this sort of candid way. But yeah, Redemption is a track that I enjoy, but for me drags on a little bit long, or feels longer than it is, and kind of feels like Drake riffing on ideas he's explored in a more artistic way, I guess, on previous records. But that's not to say that it's not one of the best tracks on Views. That said, Redemption kind of draws to a close the more wintry, introspective portion of the album. As you know, the transitioners tell us, this album is supposed to, you know, go through the seasons of Toronto, which are supposed to be quite drastic. While their winters are really, really cold, their summers are really, really hot. And I think the next track kind of leads you in to the beginning of the summer portion of this album, but that's something that we're going to explore on part 2. But first, let's go through the next couple of tracks, which the first one is called With You and features PARTYNEXTDOOR.
It's about us right now, girl, where you going? MIA in the MIA, you do you, girl, the haters gon' hate. Cut them off like you SZN, girl. Breaking you off, it's so real, I can't fake that, babe. I'm with you. Linking me down on my line. Busy as usual, but we should make some time. Mixing vodka and emotions, tapping into your emotions. Dry cry cause I'm hopeless. I need you around, I need you. Oh. It's about us right now, girl, where you going?
So with you, you can already feel the change of tempo as the seasons start to change on Views. As I said, it's not my favourite type of concept and feels like a bit of a cop-out, but as I said, you can clearly see the junctures and the changes in this album. But yeah, with You, it's much more up-tempo, like with Preach, more of a P&D song featuring Drake, but again, like Preach, I really love Drake's delivery on this. I feel like his delivery on his verse is really, really good. The track itself, lyrically, feels a little bit like filler, much like Preach. It does feel like a bit of filler, but as I said, it does change the tempo and lead you into the more upbeat tracks on the album as we reach the summer portion of this concept, really. But yeah, from Redemption, Drake does kind of seem to let go a little bit of the longing for exes that he's displayed on the early portion of this album, is instead sort of seeking something a bit more happy and a bit more settled, rather than, you know, his exes, or the more lustful tone that is kind of expressed in With You. But yeah, that kind of leads to the happier, more summery music that we get in the second half of the album. With You, not one of my favourite tracks, but it's one that fits that bill that I think a lot of later Drake music does, that fits perfectly on the playlist of similar sounding music, which is an issue in itself with Drake's later albums, that most of his albums feel a little bit disjointed, and despite the theme that tries to tie this together, it still doesn't quite change the fact that it's a very disparate album, a disparate body of work. But yeah, before we do move on to the happier, sunnier music in part 2, there's a track before that called Faithful featuring Pimp C and Division.
Put up in the air, that's what Ken told me, nigga. You don't know me, nigga, I done changed. We out here rapping for money, you niggas rapping for fun. I don't fuck with nobody in this shit but one.
You would think it's all mine, the way I took it. You just trying to be somebody, for you say you need somebody. I won't have affairs, I'm yours, girl. Faithful, 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 faithful. You talk like you got the juice and the squeeze. Talk like you bet it all on me. I know you been working, 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 ain't ya? You want me to show ya? Now we're in the zone, yo.
Production on Faithful is really, really great. A really just nice, soulful beat from 1985 and 40 and Boy Wonder, all teaming up to create a really beautiful piece of music. And while, you know, Division singer Daniel Daly absolutely kills it at the end with some really just elegant R&B vocals, Drake's verse to me feels a little bit clunky. a little bit lazily written and a little bit overly crude, which is something we don't usually get from Drake, and I think that's maybe why it feels clunky. And the crude lyrics that he throws on there also do defeat the tenderness, I guess, that the faithful hook kind of is supposed to express. So maybe it's meant to be an intentionally tongue-in-cheek kind of thing, but for me it just doesn't quite work. Despite the hook being very, very strong. And the Pimp C verse, as many people have said in the past, just feels a little bit out of place on this song. It would have fit much better on a different type of track, and just feels a bit weirdly placed here. Yeah, not sure what he was thinking with that one, as Pimp C's content doesn't really fit what Drake's talking about on this track. But yeah, it's another example which Drake does pretty much on every album, is a track based around female empowerment, which you know, is quite sometimes at odds with some of the more misogynistic and possessive stuff that Drake comes out with. But again, as I said, I think the dichotomy of that, it runs through Drake's music and is part of what makes him such a fascinating, relatable and just interesting personality to analyse really from a music perspective, especially as he's someone who puts so much of his life into his music. Despite the empowerment vibe, he talks much about the woman's independence attracting him, but then kind of reduces that to a more basic attraction, which does kind of defeat the point, but again addresses the dichotomy that I mentioned before. For me, it feels as though he's either you know, released a half-baked song or a half-baked concept in this song, or that it's just meant to be intentionally tongue-in-cheek. Either way, I don't think he's executed that well, despite the fact that, as I said, I think sonically, I think it sounds really, really good, and it is an enjoyable song to listen to. And up there with one of the most memorable tracks reviews, at the very least. So with the end of Faithful, the album now transitions into the sort of more summer portion of the album, as the album transitions from the more wintry season to music expressing the summers in Toronto. So we're going to go through that in part 2. Got to save on copyright in some ways, but here seems like a natural point to pause. Please do join me in part 2, but before you do jump over to part 2, please do remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and follow me on all social links below. Really appreciate that. All that said, thanks for watching part 1, and hope to see you in part 2, where we'll go through the second half of the album, the much more upbeat one, so it's going to be a lot of fun, but I'll also give you my final thoughts on the album too. So yeah, hope to see you there.